On the last episode of the Keepsake box. You want to play this game, Londa? Well, let's go. For as smart as you think you are, there's so many things that you don't know. And telling them now, I understand they're going to hurt you, but you asked for it. You think I don't understand how you feel? But nothing could be further from the truth. I was molested by an older family friend. That's how I got pregnant with you. Nobody believed me. I wanted to have an abortion, but your grandma talked me out of it. She told me that she would take over as your primary caretaker if I decided against the abortion. But after your birth, she failed to uphold her end of the bargain. She insisted that I be a full-time mother to you. She let me down, and I haven't ever forgiven her for that. She created a set of circumstances that forced me to look at you every day, the results of something that was so hurtful. I hated men after that. I went years without the desire to date. And then came Ron. I fell in love with him after all the ill feelings I had towards men. I wanted to leave you with your grandma, but Ron insisted that I bring you along. Look how that turned out for me. You destroyed everything. And now this. Cassidy gives me the exact same feelings I had when I was forced to keep you. I know that ain't right, but that's how I feel. I don't want to be her mother. I've never wanted to be anyone's mother. Your grandma forced me to be a mother to you, and Ron forced me to be a mother to Cassidy. But given the situation, I don't think he's in a position to require such anymore. So yes, I can provide for her, but I don't think I can love her in the way that I should. She's a piece of Ron, and I hate that. So I have to present you with an ultimatum because it's the only card that I have left to play. I know how you feel about your sister. I've allowed you to have a relationship with her because I know the situation between you and Ron wasn't entirely your fault. But if you decide not to take primary custody of Cassidy, understand that things will change. If you decide not to take her, you will not have access to her. I'll put her in a home and make sure that you won't be allowed to visit her without my approval. And let me tell you now that I will not grant you permission. I asked to speak to Cassidy. Surprisingly, Mom allowed me to do so. I told Cassidy that I loved her, and I promised that I'd always be there if I understood that she needed me. I told Mom that she had to do what she had to do. I didn't want Cassidy to go into the system, but I refused to pause my life so Mom could be free. She didn't deserve to be free. She deserved to live with the hardship of reflection. She deserved to see Cassidy every day, knowing that she was the product of the relationship that caused her to betray me and Grandma. She deserved it all. I hung up with Mom that day with the fear that she was going to put Cassidy into an institution. I didn't think I'd ever hear from either of them again. I knew I owed it to Cassidy to do better, but I didn't. I did what was best for me at the expense of Cassidy's well-being. I went out of my way to spite Mom, also at the expense of Cassidy's well-being. I felt awful and I cried the day away. I walked away from Cassidy, saddened over all of my unmet obligations. Chapter 11. I Loved That. Narrated by Shandora Warren. I was truly saddened by the loss of Cassidy. I guess it was more about the way things happened. I was previously okay with things being as they were, as I hadn't ever had the expectation of having Cassidy with me. But knowing that I failed to take advantage of the opportunity to take her weighed heavily upon me. The biggest part of me knew that I should have taken Cassidy, but my life really did move too swiftly. I knew it was selfish on my behalf, but my life would change with the addition of Cassidy. I didn't want my life to change, but life did change, for the better and for the worse. I continued to work at the gas station when I wanted to. But outside of that, being Antonio's girlfriend was my full-time job. There were a few things that I lost in my pursuit of Antonio. but I wasn't in the business of crying over spilled milk. Besides, what I experienced with him far surpassed my desire to hold on to most things. Cassidy was the only exception. You may be wondering why I was so in love with Antonio, especially because of the baggage that came along with him. Sure, he bought me things, but anyone could have bought me things. He took me places, but anyone could have taken me places. We had great sex, but I could have gotten that from numerous places as well. I could have gotten all of those things from someone else, but it wouldn't have been the same. No one could have been what Antonio was at that time. He had the ability to make anyone feel as if they were the only person in the world, and I loved that. For example, when I was working at the salon, I had been around Antonio and Sharon on several occasions. Sharon, a woman who Antonio obviously loved. Yet, he still managed to make me feel special in her presence. No, he didn't kiss me or hold my hand, but he catered to me. He showed me that I mattered. I remember times when he brought food to the salon, fully aware that Sharon was there as well. Yeah, he brought food for the both of us, but he sat and talked with me. He ate with me. He looked into my eyes as he spoke to me. He told me that he loved me when we parted company. I never felt as if I were second. And I had all of his attention otherwise. Antonio refused to entertain Peaches and Cream when I was around. There were several times when one of them would knock on the door when Antonio and I were in his office. Antonio would allow them to enter, but only to tell them that their company wasn't desired. And when we were all together as a group, Antonio didn't allow them to speak while I was speaking. At first, he would angrily ask, "You don't hear her talking?" But after a while, it was sufficient for him to shoot them a glance. The look was universally accepted as a request to be quiet, a request that was always honored. I often wondered if Antonio was abusive to Peaches and Cream outside of my presence. I certainly remembered seeing him choke Cream and throw her onto the floor. If I have to be honest, it bothered me. I had previously been abused, and the thought of them experiencing that was hurtful to me. I would even stick up for them by saying that it was okay. But as Antonio explained, everyone had a place. Our world only operated properly because everyone stayed in line. He explained that to me in front of Peaches and Cream. I was saddened and embarrassed for them. But it wasn't me. And what Antonio said was true. That was the nature of the world that we lived in. And that's how everything stayed in place. I can't blame anyone who views those things as disrespectful. Honestly, they were. But at the time, I felt that Antonio was showing me where I fell in his value system. I was in love with him. He was showing me that he was in love with me as well. He promised to show me where I stood with him, and he did. So I took it all in, and I accepted everyone for where they fell in the system. I no longer cared about the look of it all. In spite of the fact that I lived fairly close to Sharon, Antonio didn't hide me, and I didn't try to be hidden. As far as I was concerned, if Antonio wanted her to be more relevant, she would have been. It was easy to disregard her existence, and I did. I got comfortable with Antonio and the life that he provided for me. What is the life of which I speak? Let me explain. I I've told you that Antonio did a lot for me, but it was more than that. Antonio exhibited a level of attention to detail that most people would fail to maintain, specifically over a long period of time. It was an unusual phenomenon. He was extremely intense about anything to which he was attached. Antonio purchased a car for me. It was my dream car, a fact that Antonio was very much aware of. It's easy to pay attention long enough to see the surface of what someone likes. But it was deeper than that with Antonio. No detail when I noticed. Antonio didn't just purchase the car, but he purchased it in the exact color I wanted. He purchased it with the exact specifications that I wanted for the interior. And he took care of it in the same way that he took care of me. I never had to remember to get an oil change. Antonio took care of that. I never had to wash it or vacuum it. Antonio took care of that as well. Antonio didn't pay for the maintenance like he paid for most things. He did the work himself. As he explained it, there were things that had to be nurtured personally because they were too important to entrust to anyone else. Antonio told me that he would always handle my affairs hands-on because he wanted anything to be tied to me to be kept to his standards. According to Antonio, my car was an extension of me. Therefore, it had to be treated properly. I was an extension of him, so I had to be treated properly as well. Antonio told me that he'd refused to allow anyone else to sleep with me because no one would be able to please me in the way that he could. Although he said it with the utmost sincerity and absolute conviction, it was laughable. He really pretended that my monogamy wasn't self-serving on his behalf. But that's who Antonio was, and that's who I allowed him to be. I didn't want anyone else. I didn't think that there was anyone else that could take care of me in the way that Antonio did. I was happy to live in that fairy tale with him. And just as Antonio was attentive in material things, he was also attentive in experiences. I've mentioned that we went to Hawaii. Our trip was absolutely amazing from start to finish. I hadn't ever been on a trip that was on that level. I hadn't ever been on a plane prior to that point. 12 years my senior, Antonio had experienced much more and insisted on making all of the arrangements. That was easier for me, so I allowed him to do so. A couple of days prior to the trip, Antonio asked me to clear my schedule. I did as he requested. Antonio picked me up early one morning. He asked if he could make a decision for me. I agreed to his request. Without the benefit of me knowing where we were going, Antonio drove for 4 hours before arriving at a salon. We drove 4 hours for me to get my hair done? I asked. I could have gotten my hair done anywhere. You could have, but they are the best. You are the best, and you deserve the best. And that's what Antonio said to me. We walked into the salon. 2 African women welcomed me and told me that they would take good care of me. Both women simultaneously braided my hair. Antonio sat with me the entire time, only leaving to retrieve pain meds for the headache that I had received. Typically an 8-hour job, the women finished my hair in just over 3. Not only was it fast, but it was beautiful. And Antonio was right. By my standards at the time, they were the absolute best. Antonio took me home and spent the rest of the day with me. He arrived early the next morning. Once again, I had no idea where we were headed. I trusted Antonio and followed him blindly. Again, we arrived at a salon that was hours away. I didn't ask any questions that day. I followed him inside. Opposed to a hair salon, we were at a nail salon. Antonio asked if he could choose my service, and I allowed him to do so. He chose the Gararufa pedicure. Small fish swam around, nibbling any dead skin cells that may have been present on my feet. The result? My feet were as soft as a baby's bottom. Of course, it prompted a conversation about interspecies and mutually beneficial animal relationships. But I have to be honest, I didn't expect anything different. Afterwards, Antonio insisted that I also get a manicure, even though I had gotten my nails done earlier in the week. I already knew that he would choose a French manicure. I wasn't a fan of French manicures, but I had already told Antonio that I would allow him to choose for me. In the end, I realized that he had amazing taste. My nails were beautiful. I fell in love with them, and I have worn my nails that way ever since. But knowing Antonio, I knew that there was a method to the madness. I inquired, of course. I asked Antonio why he had an attachment to French manicures. I expected an elaborate animal reference, but Antonio's answer was simple. Yeah, Antonio's answer was simple. For him. Sometimes less is more. Your strength is in the fact that you are beautifully understated. Don't ever let your things speak so loudly that people can't hear what you have to say. That was the thing about Antonio. As Grandma would say, he went all around his elbow to get to his thumb. I always knew exactly what Antonio meant, but he usually insisted on taking the long route around every conversation. Antonio didn't like nail art, as he thought it was gaudy. For anyone else, it would have been sufficient to just say that. But Antonio always worded things in the most complex of ways. He was like a writer of fables. There was always something to be learned. I both loved and hated that about him. I was at the nail salon for hours. Antonio stayed with me for the entire duration of my visit, only leaving to retrieve food for me. Upon his return, Antonio spoon-fed me. Knowing that I had gotten my nails done, he didn't want me to blemish the paint. He literally sat beside me and put the food inside of my mouth. He was very catering in that way. Antonio took me home and spent the rest of the day with me. On the third day, Antonio took me shopping. Although most men get annoyed with the process, Antonio never did. He patiently waited as I went from store to store, ever so indecisively. He never seemed to mind, though. Antonio was the most patient man that I knew. I loved that about him. And finally, it was time for our vacation. I was content to just be going to Hawaii, but that wasn't enough for Antonio. He capitalized on the opportunity to make it memorable. Everything was designed to be comfortable and enjoyable for me. Hawaii was amazing. From the moment we boarded the plane, Antonio went above and beyond. My very first plane ride was first class. I was nervous about the turbulence. Antonio held my hand until it was over. After making sure that I was comfortable, Antonio ordered breakfast for me. Bacon that was a little too soft, eggs that were a little too cheesy, and grits with sugar, opposed to butter and pepper, just as I would have ordered for myself. When we landed, We didn't have to wait around for transportation like many of the other passengers. Antonio had arranged everything in advance. We arrived at a beautiful hotel suite that was right on the water. I was excited about being in Hawaii, but Antonio insisted that we take a nap. He wanted to make sure that I was well rested for what the night had in store for me. Not only was the nap appreciated, but certainly well needed. Antonio and I spent the entire day partying and the entire night having sex. And it wasn't just any kind of sex. It was the best sex. Antonio and I had sex on the beach, sex on the balcony, and sex in the water. We had sex everywhere. It was amazing. You would think that it would get old, but it didn't. Sex with Antonio never got old. We spent the entire week that way, and I never tired of him. It seemed that he never tired of me either. I never wished I was anywhere else. When we returned, I expected Antonio to take a break from me. I had to be honest with myself about our situation. Antonio had businesses that he needed to attend to, but I also knew that he had other women. I thought back to when Antonio and Sharon returned from Jamaica. Antonio had immediately started playing makeup with me. I expected that he would have makeup time with his other women upon our return, but that was not to be the case. Antonio came home with me, disregarding any and everything else that needed to be done. And that's how we lived from that point forward. If Antonio needed to be somewhere, he expected me to accompany him. If I couldn't accompany him, he expected me to immediately be available upon his return, and I was more than happy to oblige. Many won't understand that level of attachment, but imagine being with someone with Antonio's lifestyle. Can you imagine how many women wanted to be in my shoes? Imagine knowing that he had a million other things to do, yet he'd always choose you. And it wasn't just that he chose me. Ken had chosen me as well. But Antonio chose me without me having to hurt. I didn't have to discover his indiscretions and ask him to choose me. He did so of his own free will, and he made me feel that it was his pleasure to do so. That was the blessing and the curse of being with someone like Antonio. His love was thick and powerful, and he freely surrounded me with it. And I loved him, so I breathed it in until I choked. I loved everything about him. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.